It is with great pleasure that I am able to present our president of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Catherine Allgor came to us a year ago, October, and we are just delighted that she has taken an interest in the numismatic collection and has just been a positive force for all of us here. And it is my great pleasure to introduce her to say a few words to us. Catherine?
Thank you, Anne. Several people today have told me that you're a national treasure, but I think due to actually the nature of this collection, you're an international treasure. My charge today is to welcome you officially to the Massachusetts Historical Society, but since you've been hard at work since 8:30, it seems literally kind of late in the day. But I couldn't pass up this chance to give you an official welcome and to tell you how proud and happy we are to host the Medal Collectors of America and this very important conference, Art and Memory, the Role of Medals. I see some old friends here, but I know for some of you this is your first time. And if you haven't been reading our literature, the Massachusetts Historical Society is a completely private, nonprofit historical society. We were the first in the nation, 1791. In addition to our really unparalleled collection of coins and medals, we have some 14 million objects. We're really known for, including the entire corpus of the Adams Papers, and we're known for being the home of the Adams Papers, and we're very famous for our early America collection. But really, we collect all the way through, and in fact, some of the most recent additions to our collections, we collected the hats and the paraphernalia and the signs from the women's marches. So we collect all the way through. I have been coming here since 1996. I came when I was a dissertation student, and I really became a historian working with this collection, and that's where I first met Anne Bentley. You were downstairs at the time. You were doing paper, and then subsequently, in my career as an academic, I would come here and I would see Anne, and she had, at this point, moved on to the art and artifacts. And she alerted me to an item in our collection that I think I can truly say is just odd. It was a little rosewood casket with the hair of the founders in it. It was odd, but it didn't stop me from writing an essay about it, and actually it's part of my book, The Queen of America, Mary Cutts's Life with Dolly Madison. And then I came here last year, and I have to say, among the first to really welcome me home, as I like to say, was Anne and a very special group of people, you all. I recall a wonderful dinner with Tom Adams and Nancy Morda, and then an equally wonderful brunch with John and Regina, and that's where I also met Neil and CJ. You could see I met lots of friendly people, and I was also well-nourished between the brunches and the dinners. And I've been so privileged over the past year to get to know a little bit about the collection. And I say a little bit because there's just so many stories to learn. To see what a European head of state has gifted our own John Adams with, the odd story of the commemoration for the thing that didn't happen. But I've also been very impressed by the level of authority and passion among those who collect and study medals. So people will love something or they'll have a passion for it, but it's really the level of expertise and authority that impressed me. And I saw the beautiful books that you all have produced and published. I've read some of the articles in the journals, and again, it is this expertise that is so impressive to me. Also this year, I've had the chance to see people who travel to the Massachusetts Historical Society to see our numismatic collections. And they come from across the world, and often they're coming to see a particular piece that is on their bucket list, so it's something they've wanted to see in person for decades. And I've been so privileged to be in the room while Anne is taking this thing out that they have just been waiting their lives to see. And the looks on their faces as they see it, as they listen to Anne talk about it. The word awesome has just become one of those words that mean kind of like, you know, neat or cool or great or something, but they were truly awed to see it. As a scholar myself, I've been particularly gratified to see young people, young historians, and people in other disciplines, coming to see the collection and understanding that they're not just looking at particular pieces or kinds of pieces, not just interested in the stories and the context of the actual thing itself, but they're using these objects as primary sources in order to construct a larger historical argument. Like any human endeavor, there are trends in history, and one of the trends now is a really serious study of commemorations, celebrations, parades, and all that go with it, with an idea of making arguments about the beginnings of American national pride, or the fashioning of the early republic, or a particular event in history. And to see scholars now beginning to take numismatics seriously in that study has been, as I said, especially gratifying. I guess what I want to say from almost my year and a month is that I've come to see that Anne Bentley actually is the curator of two collections. One is an unparalleled collection of coins and medals, and the other is an unparalleled group of people. You are. And I think she stewards both collections with love and most ably, and I think you agree with me. So, thank you for letting me address you. I will be joining you for the latter part of the day. I want to come for the final panel, and I'll be joining you for cocktails. So, continue to learn.
Just going on track. So we now go get to the book portion of our day, which is, as we all know, you buy the book before the medal. So Len Augsburger has a very important presentation for us, because now the book is available online almost, thanks to his efforts and many, many people who work with him. So without further ado, once Gavin gets there we go, we're all set. Len, it's over to you. You got it? Here. That's forward. Okay.
All right, good afternoon. I am Len Augsburger. I'm the project coordinator of the Newman Numismatic Portal, which is funded by the Eric P. Newman Numismatic Education Society and administered through Washington University in St. Louis, where I am on staff. All right, quick commercial here. This is truly Medal Week in New England. In addition to this event today, there's more Tuesday night up at Bowdoin College. Steve Scher, Peter Van Alphen, and Susan Wegner speaking there. And then next Saturday, there's a program at the ANS, which I'm sure Udo will talk more about in a minute later on today. All right, so here we go. We might be dragging a little bit, so the chimpanzee is here to liven things up. So I told my wife I was going to bring out the chimpanzee, and she said, well, is there going to be yelling and screeching? Well, probably not, but Rob Rodriguez hasn't spoken yet today, so maybe later. All right, so everyone thinks the Bible and evolution are not compatible. Well, they actually agree about this. They agree that the chimps came before us. So sometimes it's good to check with them and ask them what we want to know. So the chimpanzee is asking himself, okay, how do I do my numismatic inquiry? And there's basically a few questions that really drive what we're doing in terms of our research. We want to know who made something. We want to know why it was made. We want to know how it was made. And we want to know how it was used. And as we'll see, these questions drive a lot of our investigation. All right, so many of us got started collecting US coins as American collectors. And we got our penny albums and filled them out. And we can compare these federal coins to medals with these questions and come to some conclusions. So in terms of US federal coinage, some of these questions are really obvious. Who made it? The Mint made it. Why did they make it? It was money. They needed money for, to establish a national presence. And how did they make it? That obviously evolves very much in common with manufacturing metals, not completely the same, but substantial amount of crossover. And how was it used? Well, it was used in commerce, and of course, a very small percentage has been pulled out and preserved by collectors. Now, if we look at these questions with respect to metals, we get more varied answers. Who made metals? Well, they were made by the mint. They were also made privately. Why were they made? Many reasons: presentation, ceremony, commemoration, sometimes for profit, sometimes just for art. And again, with the technology, very much tied into the same technology that we use for manufacturing coins. And then how are they used? Well, metals really don't have a physical utility. They're really art or historical artifacts. So these questions are going to impact the bibliography of metals. We're now faced with a multitude of sources for uncovering the origin and the motivation of making a specific piece. The information is disparate, it's all over the place. And this, I think, is actually sort of one of the charms of the metal field. It's wide open, you can jump in a lot of different places, there's a lot of original work to be done. Whereas with federal coins, for example, you just have a single guidebook. There's many other books too, but you can have a primary book like that, and it's something that guides a lot of what happens, and we simply don't have an analog to that in the world of metals. All right, so where does this information come from to do this work on varying disparate metals and things that are, in a sense, all over the place? Well, we get it from books. There are commercial publications, auction catalogs, fixed price lists, exhibit catalogs, which I think are a little bit underrated, maybe not as widely published, sometimes hard to find, periodicals, archival sources, and increasingly electronic resources. So let's digress just for a minute on the electronic resources. We really live in the information age. As Scott pointed out this morning, whether you like it or not, this is what it is. This is the reality, and we have to embrace the technology. And the numismatic field itself is very much online. All the organizations have their own website. We have social media. We have chat groups. You can talk about coins 7 by 24 if you want to. And we have more and more online databases, certainly of which the Newman Numismatic Portal is one, but there are other great resources out there, the Ans Library catalog, the Ans Object Catalog, other efforts such as Token Catalog, which is a crowdsourced effort that has cataloged over 500,000 American tokens. A lot of people don't know about that, but it just shows you sort of what's possible with the internet. That kind of catalog would have been impossible to create in the pre-internet era. And we could literally have a second conference just on the subject of digital resources and what's out there, what's available, and where is that field headed. All right, so why books? Why not just use screens all the time? And there are some things happening with books that might not be so obvious. But the first thing is really human connection. That's sort of one of these fundamental things about the human condition that drives what we do. We can't connect with collectors 100 years ago, but the field was small enough then that if you own a book that one of them owned, it very likely has their name in it, and it's probably the name of either someone you've heard of or someone you can learn a lot about from various sources. And then we also have this desire for understanding across time. And we live 70 years, but we can form a broader understanding by understanding these objects and books that came before us. And then there's something I'll call the intimacy of proximity, and this just speaks to having a physical connection with a book. It's a much more tangible thing than just looking at a screen. And we'll talk about the Luba book in a little bit, but you really can't capture what this book meant at the time without looking at a physical copy of it. So books really inspire in ways that screens cannot, more particularly the books that you actually purchase, because that represents a personal investment in whatever that topic is. So I think people are going to find books, especially that they've invested in with their blood and treasure, are just going to be more compelling and will just really inspire them in a way that you're not going to get out of a screen. Practically, I think books are just easier to use than digital things. It's much easier when you're working on something that have 5 or 10 books open in front of you than be digging for things on a screen and moving things around. So there's really no conflict here. I think at the present time we have this great era where we get to enjoy both of these resources, and we're sort of blessed to be at this time where the digital information is just exploding. And what we're really going to be judged on tomorrow is, how good a job did we do with resources that we had. We don't look at people 100 years ago and say, well, they were all wrong about this. We know they didn't have some of the resources we have. All right. So more particularly, characteristics of books on metals. Because they are disparate, decentralized, that carries with it a few things. One, they tend to be lower print runs. They are narrow, niche, esoteric. There are some more general books, but most metal books are pretty specialized. And as a result, they do tend to be expensive, and they're truly labors of love for the most part. And I think, in general, probably better done than most numismatic books. And then the other thing you're dealing with all numismatic books is that you have to deal with a lot of images, and anyone who's worked on a catalog or a book understands that it's really easy to get images mixed up with your text, and it's tedious to keep all that straight to begin with. Now, despite this diverse nature of metals, we still have a need to classify things. And so we have a question with respect to books. We talked about this morning about the definition of a metal, and it's surprisingly slippery. And when it comes to classifying metals, we find that's also somewhat slippery. So we have a few things driving how we classify metals, and by extension, books about metals. On the one hand, we have collectors want to classify things. They want to take a group of things and make some order out of it. Dealers have also a need. They need to market things. So when you have a bunch of different things, what you want is one compelling story to put around it to market it. And we see this play out in some of these early American sales from the 19th century. They had a little bit easier because the Washingtonia was especially popular at this period. So you would expect every cabinet to have a nice collection of Washingtonia, and it would be easy to market it and catalog it as such. And then we get into some other 19th century sales. We'll look at those in a minute. And then at the same time, we have books starting to appear on different series of metals, Washingtonia, American history metals by Betts. And so John Adams asked a provocative question in the advisory a couple issues ago about, was this taxonomy driven by the dealers? Was it driven by the collectors or the authors? And I think it was kind of a group effort. This is a somewhat small community. Everybody's talking to everyone else. And they sort of come to this point as a group. All right, so this is what the Holland Sale was a very important early American sale of a metal collection, cataloged by Woodward. And he came up with about 50 different ways to classify these things. There was important point made this morning that the origin of a lot of these is war or military, and that's really true. You can see a lot of these groups could trace back to that. So with that, I thought I would look at the Ans Library catalog since they've been at it 150 years. If anybody had a good idea about how to do it, it would be them. But we get kind of the same answer, and that's really that this is a mess and it's a hard problem. And in terms of teaching interns, David Hill's had a lot of challenges with this. And this is just a partial list, and you can see it gets very niche-y very quick. You've got things like chess and polar exploration and plague, centenarians. So you can see some of these are pretty narrow topics. All right, a couple other attempts at this. Chapman, again, tried this in 1882 with the Bushnell catalog. Bushnell collected a little bit more narrowly, so that wasn't too difficult. And then Julian's the book on medals of the U.S. Mint has gotten a lot of traction in terms of being adopted as a cataloging source. He's got about 15 different categories, and I think some of the reasons this has caught on is because, first of all, this was a very original work. He pulled a lot of information from the metal die books in the National Archives that hadn't been seen before. He put catalog numbers in there, which catalogers like and dealers like. He limited the scope, it's US Mint only. That causes some problems. For example, in the Commissia set, there's some French pieces, and even though everyone agrees they're Commissia pieces, they're not in this book because it had to come out of the US Mint in order to be in this book. And then he's confined himself to a specific era. So he's made the problem neat and clean and came up with a lot of original research, and this particular system for mint medals has been pretty widely adopted. All right, so with that, we're going to actually look at a few medal books, and if your favorite's not here, don't be surprised since our time is limited. We'll start out with Medaille sur la règne de Louis le Grand. This book was mentioned this morning, or at least the medal series, and this was a popular book at the time. We have several binding variants, also published in German. So fairly good distribution on this at the time. There are modern print-on-demand copies you can get. In general, I don't think much of them because they're not really historical artifacts like an original copy of the work would be. And if you just want to look at the text, you can do that online. So let's look at a sample page. This is birth of Louis le Grand. And what the book is, it's a series of 300 medals commemorating his reign. And if we just read through the first one, under the reign of Louis XIII, France triumphed in every way, heretics overpowered, Austria humiliated, but the king did not have an heir. And finally, God touches the pious king and virtuous queen and gave them a son, to the joy of all French. So you can see this is just a tremendous piece of nationalistic propaganda. And so what is not in this book is a lot of information as medal collectors that we'd like to see. We'd like to know who engraved these medals, who designed them, who made them, how were they distributed, what medals were they struck on, a ton of questions. And that's simply not in the book. Part of it is that it would have been more expensive to put all that in. But of course, the other part was the primary function of this book was really propaganda. So unfortunately, we don't get that. And Dave Fanning has written more extensively on this particular book. All right, moving over to the Netherlands, we have Van Loon, Histoire métallique des 17 provinces des Pays-Bas. This was actually written in Dutch, and my apologies, I haven't seen Peter Weiss here, but my apologies, I don't speak Dutch, so I'm partial to the French translation of the book. In any sense, this is historical medals of the lower countries from 1505 to 1716. And we have an interesting frontispiece here. Instead of glorification of the king, what we have instead is glorification of the author. And the cherub is pulling the curtain away from him, and then he's got this nice thing on the bottom where he says, "Render to Van Loon the immortality that you must." But one thing I do like about the engraving is in the right side there, you can see books and you can see medals surrounding the books. So here's a guy 300 years ago enjoyed having his books and medals in front of him, and who can't relate to that? So that's kind of timeless. All right, and then here's a sample page. This is a papal medal, 1582, talking about the Pope establishing the new calendar. And we have some neat symbols on the reverse that Van Loon explains. The snake with the tail in its mouth, symbolizing a year. We talked a little bit about that this morning. And then we've got a ram on there for the zodiac symbol for March. And then the symbols sort of evolve and evoke antiquity and the eternal nature of time. All right, moving on. This is a book on Napoleon medals published by the ANS in 1912 by Ernest Babylon. It's folio, it's a massive volume. And what we see here is in the mid-19th century, you start to have this veneration of Washington. And it wasn't just on our medals. I mean, this was something that really was part of the culture. And it's similar with Napoleon in France. Even today, if you go see Napoleon's tomb in Paris, it's a tourist spot now, but it really gives you a good sense of how the French people really worship this guy. In any way, Babylon felt a previous work did not really sufficiently address Napoleon's legacy in terms of education and government administration that he imparted to France, and so it took up this work. The entries are chronological, assigned consecutively, and gives you a lot of the historical context of each medal, along with some bibliographic notes, very much like the Van Loon. And here's a sample page. This is Babylon 1, the return from Egypt in 1799. Bonaparte undertook a campaign in the Ottoman territories around the turn of the century with the idea of promoting French trade interests and undermining those of the British. And then what we've got on the medal here, we've got a portrait medal on one side and then some allegory on the reverse side. And this is kind of a meme for medals. You see this a lot. You have a portrait and then more meaningful symbology on the reverse. So in this case, we've got France being liberated by Napoleon, and then on his ship, there's a sphinx on the prow symbolizing Egypt, and this is Napoleon returning to France. All right, now we get to the Luba, Medallic History of the United States of America. This book was so compelling that John Adams et al. Had to come back 100 years later and write another book about the making of the book. If you're going to have one, you should have both of them. But this is quite a production, privately published, 2-volume set, special paper, The plate volumes were done in France, and then the text was all letterpress in New York. And one thing we see is on the frontispiece, we don't have a full cut of Luba. It's a little bit more understated now. He does give his institutional affiliations, but that's about it. Surprisingly, he was not really well connected with the American Numismatic Society, and the ANS, in fact, had to buy their own copy of the book. There's a list of subscribers in their copy today that you can see in the library. The text itself describes 86 medals, again, really with the theme of war, the Commission Americana, Presidential and Military Series. It's really a good piece of research. He put a ton of original sources are detailed in this work, so it's valuable from that point of view, aside from the physical production. And then there's just a sample plate of the Washington before Boston medal. Much later, there was a reprint of this done, which Charles Davis describes this book. He wasn't too impressed with it, but just says it carries on its dust jacket the biggest bibliophilic lie. That is, in keeping with the quality of our other publications, we've accurately retained the character of the original edition, which they most certainly did not. And if you see the original edition, very massive, impressive book with great research in it. And while I was putting this slide together, I pulled the reprint off my shelf. I dropped it about 3 times, and I think Charles would have been proud of that. All right, now let's move back across the pond. There was a series of works by Sir George Hill, who was the curator in the British Museum for many years, a specialist in Renaissance medals. And this is one of his books on Italian medals, covering 1390 to 1530. And then he wrote other books besides this. And this particular one, 2-volume set, you can get some idea of the size of the books there. And then just an example page, he has a papal medal here from Rome. And then a lot of notes on just cross-references to other source, and then some explanation of what the medal actually is. So you have a specialty in medals, and hopefully look for books like this, because they are out there. All right, and then here's a more modern Italian book, Italian medals of the 16th century, describes about 3,000 medals, 2 volumes of text, 1 plate volume, mostly Italian, but there's a fair amount of English in it, and then just a sample medal from here, from Siena, by Pastorino. All right, another book more recently published by David Alexander with the American Numismatic Society, covering American art medals from 1909 to 1995, more specifically the series of the Circle of Friends and the Medallion and the Society of Medallists. And this was a series of 128 art medals. He's got 1 or 2 pages on each, great color photography, and then a nice explanation of all the books. This sample page here, we have the Motherhood medal done by Brenner in 1911, and very popular medal, but Alexander makes the observation that this one's really almost a copy of something that Brenner's mentor did, Roti, entitled Maternité. And if you look at both of the medals, you can see that, yes, indeed, the Brenner one is pretty close to the Roti one. And of course, we heard a little bit more about Brenner and Roti earlier today that was interesting. I wasn't aware of all that. All right, and then we have another work, British Historical Medals, published by Seabees in the 1980s. One of the volumes is dedicated strictly to Victoria, 1837-1901, and then a more general work from 1760 to 1960. The medals are all chronologically arranged. a lot of illustrations. And I think the ultimate compliment on this book is that if you look at the copies in the ANS, they've been very well used. So a lot of people checking that book out. All right, so that's just to give some idea of what kind of metal books are out there. Obviously, there's a lot more, but I just want to give everyone a little flavor of what's available. All right, so finally, in conclusion, the metal books, like the metals themselves, sort of defy classification. So we do the best we can. And I think the books are more compelling than what you're going to find on a computer. If you need to look up a price from Tom Elder's 103rd sale, lot 29, that's a great thing to do on the computer. If you need to search for something, the computer's great for that. But if you're actually trying to study metals, I think, or a particular series, it's most instructive to have that physical text in front of you. And the books are really by nature specialized, and they're labors of love. And if you can't find what you're looking for, consider writing it. So I met a gentleman this morning that's working on early metals, or early 20th century metals of the US Mint. They've never been cataloged, so why not a book? All right, thank you.
There are 15 minutes for questions. We will have the mic, so we open the floor.
Yes.
What about ebooks? They seem to me to combine some of the characteristics of online and a handheld book. I'm partial to paper myself, but having to use them as research book, I find the electronic versions compelling.
Yeah, you have to be willing to use anything, and maybe something is just available in an ebook that isn't available as a regular book, or you just need to look up one thing and you don't want to pay for a physical copy. So I think as you're building your library, you've got to be thinking about what's important to me. What do I really want to see in paper? But at the same time, you can't ignore the tremendous resources that are out there electronically. Yes.
You might mention that portal is searchable, so if you want to look at the American Journal of Numismatics, which I have an original complete set, and if I want to find out about W. Elliott Woodard, I just need to push a button and I get 143 citations. Mm-hmm. The alternative to that is to spend a whole weekend looking through it. So I've made great use of it in trying to find things, especially in certain catalogs like Woodward catalogs. They're superb. For research I do, it's been a really marvelous thing. I mentioned in the letter in the hall earlier that you have time, right? You have time. I don't want to take anybody else's time. That they've now digitized Coin World, but Coin World has never been digitized. And a number of years ago, Bob Bashlow, some of you might remember him, said, I really played a joke on Coin World in the early days. I wrote an article about the obituary of a gentleman in Russia who, before the Bolshevik Revolution, was the main supplier of coins to the Chapman brothers, and they printed it, but it was completely fake. So I asked Margot Russell, it was the second editor, you know about this? No, there's no way to find it. So Leonard said he's going to look for it.
We'll find it, yeah. And computers are indispensable for search. There's just no substitute, absolutely none. Yes, in the back.
I just wanted to make mention in terms of literature, ancillary sources, because you're looking at purely numismatic material. But for example, with Betts metals, one of, I think in his later years, John Ford got involved with a lot of other non-Betts listed metals that should be in Betts because he purchased Davenport's list of treaties, related to American history, and then working in reverse, he then looked for metals commemorating the treaties, and then he came up with all these medals. So, there were other sources, including, periodicals and newspapers and whatever. I mean, I've just did an exhibit of U.S. Assay Commission medals, and one of the sources of information were the annual proceedings of the U.S. Assay Commission, which isn't a numismatic publication, but by looking in there, you can glean information that you can then apply.
Yeah, absolutely. We had one of the earlier slides. We had the front cover of Lester Olson's book on iconography of Franklin, and it's there are these, as you said, ancillary sources out there that speak directly to the medals, even if they aren't specifically about the medals. Absolutely. Yes.
So if the books are not in print anymore, like Van Loon say, I went down to in New York City to look at their copy, but how would you get it? Is it online?
I don't know if Van Loon specifically is online. I would imagine it is.
What do you do?
Right. So almost all, I can't say all, but there are an amazing number of books that have been scanned by Google Books, HathiTrust, Newman Portal, just very narrowly within numismatics. So the number of books online is amazing, but if something is totally not available, you look in something like WorldCat, which aggregates every single library catalog in the world, and it will tell you it's at this library, which library is closest to you. So there are other places for looking for out-of-print books. AB Books has tons of out-of-print books listed for sale. Often they're really cheap, so that's a good source too.
The plug-in for the work that I kept going back to while I was preparing my thing today, and that I always keep going back to, is Forer's Biographical Dictionary of Medallists. It's still unbeaten, even though it's a century old, and it is online, all 9 volumes.
Yeah, we have the Forer is on Newman Numismatic Portal. It is one of our most consulted resources on Newman Portal. Absolutely, yeah. And I think a lot of it is just because we put all 8 volumes in one place and explain what's exactly in each one of them. A lot of the other ones are just sort of scattered out there, so I think having them all together in one place has been a draw towards getting traffic to those on the Newman Portal.
It online, but there's also that modern volume, which is an index by subject that not everybody knows about.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly which ones we have. I think we have 8 of them. There may be an extra one in there somewhere was published later. I'd have to check. Yes?
Now that books are being put online, there are people who collect books as collectibles. What do you think is going to happen to the value of those libraries?
Right. I'm going to dial a friend on this one. We have a numismatic bookseller in the audience today. David, do you want to comment on that?
Well, what we've been seeing is that... Hi. What we've been seeing is that maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, when things started popping up online, there were a number of people who were afraid that the value of their library would decline, and so they stopped spending quite so much money on books, which made it a self-fulfilling prophecy since that drove prices down. In the past year or two, though, I've been seeing that people have been coming to the realization that their bookshelf and the internet can coexist. People like their books. They simply like them. They like having them around. They like walking into a room and seeing them. They like holding them. They sometimes like writing in them. So these are all reasons that I'm not despairing for the future.
Yes, Dave. Oh.
As the numismatic director of Whitman Publishing, among other things I do, when the Nook came out and also Kindle, Whitman was quite worried, and actually sales dropped for about 2 or 3 years because people said, well, I better not buy Whitman Books. But in recent times, the Whitman book sales are not up to what they were 15 years ago. And at one time, there were 150,000 copies of guidebooks sold during 1963 or 4. But Whitman book sales, which are a good barometer because they're sold all over America, have been up. And as a good example of a niche Whitman book, a few years ago, I wrote a book on Civil War tokens for the Whitman, the guidebook of Civil War tokens. It had a print run of 5,000. It sold out. Then they revised it, had another print run of 5,000. That sold out. Now there's a third print run, which is still there. But the Civil War Token Society only has 650 members. Now, one little problem I have with the Metal Collectors of America, as John Adams and Skylar Lichty and other people know, is that why don't we have like hundreds and hundreds of members because people don't want to join organizations. Why right now does the American Numismatic Association have 25,000 members, including 5,000 life members who get hard copies as the numismatist? Only 5,000 others get hard copies. Everyone else is getting it electronic. So I love hard books, hard copy books, but I do think that the internet, they both can coexist, and that researchers, which I number myself one of, will find that one day spent on the numismatic portal is equal to a month spent in my own library.
Thanks. I'll just give one shout out for a Whitman book, 100 Greatest American Medals and Tokens. It's like $20, and it's a coffee table book, but it's got great pictures in it and a really good overview of a lot of different American medals.
One book, Len, you didn't mention that I find very valuable when you were talking about British historical medals, Eimer's book on historical medals. I use it all the time.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.